They offered a starving island free food, free electricity support, and free internet. And the government said nothing. Not no, nothing. And that silence is the most dangerous thing that has happened to this regime in 67 years. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you is not a story about Cuba. It's a story about how power collapses and how it's already beginning. On April 21st, the Trump administration placed an offer on the table in Havana: free Starlink satellite internet for every single person on the island, not filtered through government servers, not routed through state infrastructure, directly to households. 2 full years of uncensored, unfiltered connectivity that the Cuban government cannot monitor, cannot throttle, and cannot shut down. On top of that, tens of millions of dollars in humanitarian aid, agricultural support targeting food shortages directly, and infrastructure assistance for Cuba's collapsing power grid. The State Department confirmed the offer is real. It is currently sitting on the table, and Havana has not said a word. If this is the first time you're hearing about this, drop a comment below right now, because most people have no idea this is happening, and that's exactly why we cover it here every single day. 9 days after the offer was confirmed, Cuban state media published stories about sanctions. They did not mention free internet. They did not mention free food. They did not mention infrastructure help. Granma, the official Communist Party newspaper, ran its usual headlines and buried the offer entirely. No statement from Diaz-Canel, no response from the foreign ministry. Just silence. And here is what that silence actually means, because this is the part nobody is explaining. If Cuba's government believed this offer was a trap or a manipulation, the logical move is to say so publicly. Announce it, expose it, use it as propaganda. The fact that they are saying nothing means they cannot explain it to their own people, because the moment they acknowledge the offer exists, 11 million Cubans living through daily blackouts and chronic food shortages will ask one question: why is our government saying no? That question has no answer the regime can survive, and that is not an accident. This offer was engineered, precisely, deliberately, to be exactly the thing Cuba's government cannot accept. Here is why. Cuba's entire telecommunications infrastructure runs through a single state-owned company. Every website visit, every message, every email on the island passes through government servers. When protests exploded in July 2021, the largest in decades, the government's first move was to cut internet access entirely. Connectivity in Cuba is not a utility. It is a control mechanism. Starlink bypasses all of it. It does not need ground infrastructure. It does not route through Havana. It cannot be switched off from a government office. A protest organizer in Santiago could coordinate in real time with activists in Havana. Independent journalists could upload footage without state permission. Families could communicate during blackouts when the regime cuts terrestrial networks. The State Department made clear the distribution would be island-wide. A farmer in Guantanamo province would have the same access as a senior official in the capital. That geographic leveling is not generosity. It is the dismantling of an information architecture that has kept one family in power since 1959. This is where history stops being background and becomes warning. December 2010, Tunisia. A fruit vendor set himself on fire. The government controlled television. It controlled newspapers. It did not control Facebook. Within weeks, protest footage spread faster than any censor could move. The president fled in 28 days. January 2011. Egypt. Protesters coordinated through Twitter. Mubarak shut down the internet on January 28th. 18 days later, he was gone. Libya, Syria, Bahrain. In every case where a government fell or nearly fell during the Arab Spring, the trigger was the same. The moment the regime lost control of information flow, it lost control of everything that followed. Cuba's government studied every one of those collapses. It learned the lesson. The lesson was never let the information escape. The Starlink offer is Washington saying, "We know what you're afraid of, and we're offering it for free. So here is the trap, laid out in full. If Cuba accepts, the regime loses its information monopoly overnight. 11 million people gain access to uncensored internet simultaneously. Protest coordination becomes possible at a scale the government has no capacity to contain. The surveillance architecture that has sustained control since 1959 becomes irrelevant. Accepting is regime suicide on a timeline nobody in Havana can predict or manage. If Cuba refuses, the story writes itself globally. Washington offered food to a starving island. Washington offered free internet to an isolated population. Washington offered power grid support to a country running on 4-hour electricity windows. And the government said no. One State Department source told the Associated Press directly that a rejection would be used to demonstrate conclusively that Havana prioritizes control over the welfare of its own citizens. That framing would justify additional sanctions. It would pressure the European Union to reconsider its engagement with the regime. Brussels does not want to be seen supporting a government that turns down humanitarian aid while its people go hungry. And if Cuba stays silent, it loses both slowly as the offer's existence spreads through the very channels the government cannot fully control. Accept and lose power. Refuse and lose legitimacy. Say nothing and lose both on a slower clock. There is no fourth option. Now look at the timing, because this is not coincidence. 3 days before the Starlink offer was confirmed, the Trump administration imposed fresh sanctions targeting Cuban officials directly involved in propping up Venezuela's Maduro regime. Sanctions on the government. Aid offer to the people. Those two moves running simultaneously are not contradictory. They are the same strategy operating on two tracks. One hand tightens the financial noose on the regime. The other hand opens a direct channel to the population, one that does not require Havana's permission or cooperation. This follows what we covered in our last analysis on the banking sanctions that closed Cuba's access to international payments. That move cut the regime off from institutional finance. This move offers the population a lifeline the regime cannot intercept. The pattern across the last 5 months is not random escalation. It is a structured dismantling, removing the government as the intermediary between Cuban citizens and everything they need to function. Oil was the first intermediary removed. Banking was the second. Information is now the third. The Cuban government has controlled all 4 levers since 1959: fuel, food distribution, financial access, and information. In 5 months, Washington has disrupted or eliminated 3 of them. Multiple administration sources confirmed to the Associated Press that direct military intervention is not on the table. What officials believe is that economic and information pressure may actually work, precisely because Cuba has never been this vulnerable. The worst energy crisis in recorded history. Food shortages driving thousands onto makeshift boats in open water. An economy contracting for the 3rd consecutive year. Tourism revenue gone. Remittances restricted. Banking access severed. Havana has less capacity to refuse outside help than at any point since the revolution. And Washington structured the help in a way that makes acceptance a different kind of surrender. For 67 years, the Cuban government had a story that worked. The embargo was the wall. American sanctions were the reason the lights went out and the shelves were empty. Washington was the obstacle. That story was credible because it was partially true. The Starlink offer destroys that story from the inside. Washington is now offering to help directly, government to people, bypassing every layer of state control. If Havana says no, the question every Cuban must answer for themselves becomes, who is actually blocking us from getting what we need? The answer is no longer Washington. The answer is the building on the corner with the flag on it. That answer, once it takes root in the minds of 11 million people who are already hungry and already in the dark, is more destabilizing to this regime than any military option on any map. I want to say something here that the strategic framing alone does not capture. There is something genuinely cynical about engineering humanitarian aid to be refused. And there is something genuinely cruel about refusing humanitarian aid your own people are desperate for. Both things are true at the same time. Washington designed this to be rejected. Havana is going to reject it. And the 11 million people who needed the food, the power, the connectivity, they are the terrain both sides are fighting over, not the people either side is fighting for. I have tracked this Cuba situation through every escalation: the fuel blockade, the prisoner releases, the Russian tankers, the banking cutoff, the carrier movement, and now this. Each chapter has increased pressure on the regime. Each chapter has also increased suffering for ordinary Cubans. The strategic logic is coherent. I can trace it clearly. But strategic logic does not sit in a hospital running on a generator that may or may not have fuel. It does not feed a child at a table with nothing on it. It does not explain to a grandmother why the lights have been off for 8 hours in May heat. There is a question underneath all of this analysis that I keep returning to, and it is the only question that matters when the frameworks are stripped away. At what point does the sophistication of the strategy stop being the point, and the human cost become the only number that counts? I do not have a clean answer. I am not sure one exists. But I think the question deserves to be asked out loud rather than buried under the next strategic layer. The people are not a variable. They are the whole point, or they should be. Now here is the question I am putting directly to you, and I want your real answer, not a safe one. Is this offer genuine? Not legally. Strategically. Does Washington actually want Cuba to accept, knowing what acceptance would do to the regime? Or is the offer itself the objective, designed from the beginning to produce a refusal that justifies the next escalation? I have heard strong arguments on both sides from people whose judgment I respect. Yours might be the one that changes how I think about it. Put your answer in the comments. This is the kind of analysis this audience does better than anywhere else, and this question deserves every perspective you can bring. If this video gave you something, a framework, a fact, a question you hadn't considered, hit the like button. One tap is what moves it past the algorithm and into the feeds of people who should be watching this. We publish new analysis every single day, and the next development in this story is already moving. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the right time, because the next chapter is not going to wait.